Hello everybody, I'm George from Ireland. I'm outside the house of James Ramsay MacDonald. You can see it there with the blue plaque. So James Ramsay MacDonald is famous for being the first Labour Prime Minister, although he's a pantomime villain in the Labour Party's history. Perhaps he should be National Hero of the UK for screwing over Labour for quite a long time, but also putting country before party. I shall come back to that. Anyway, you think that most Prime Ministers of the United Kingdom would be born in London, the home counties. He was born in Scotland, and not in Edinburgh, not in Glasgow, but in Lossiemouth, which is a village near the Moray Firth, so the very, very north of Scotland. And he was born into a poor family. His mother was a maidservant, his father was a farm labourer, and they were not married. And that's why it's the double-barrel surname, not because he's blue blood and broad acres, quite the opposite. So that might appear to be a considerable disadvantage in the Victorian era, when there was a very deep prejudice against those who were born out of wedlock. And actually, Horatio Bottomley, a demagogic Liberal MP, later got a hold of Ramsay MacDonald's birth certificate and published it to draw attention to the fact that Ramsay MacDonald was not born in the sanctity of marriage, because there was deep prejudice against these people. And there was even the Bastardy Act, that was the word used, passed by Parliament about dealing with those who were born outside of marriage. Anyhow, so he did well at school until he was a pupil teacher. So in those days, state schools would have only a handful of teachers, and then most people would leave school at 12, but if you were very brainy, you could stay on beyond 12, and you could be teaching the younger ones, be both a pupil and a teacher in his late teens, and then just be a teacher completely. So he later moved to London. He worked for the Social Democratic Federation. He flirted with the cause of home rule for Scotland, not independence. Nobody in the 19th century was thinking about that. That was the zenith of unionism, plus the British Empire had risen to a position of apicality. So breaking away from the UK, let alone the Empire, seemed to be daft. It was the leading science and technology country in the world, okay, then eclipsed by the United States and subsequently by Germany. So he moved in leftist circles, and he was quite a free thinker. He joined the Fabian Society, and they thought about things like equality for women, vegetarianism, really every alternative lifestyle going, though he was a fairly conventional Christian in his religious attitudes. Anyway, he married, and the union had issue. He lived in connubial bliss, though he did stray in the 1920s and 30s. I'll come back to that. Anyhow, so he joined the Labour Party. Of course, it was the Labour Representation Committee. It was a section inside the Liberal Party, first of all. And James Keir Hardie, another North Briton, was the first person elected to Parliament for Labour. It was only in 1900 that Labour split away and actually became a separate political party. So they'd only got in on the coattails of the Liberals. There were some double-seated constituencies, and some constituencies which were overwhelmingly working class would have a deal whereby these constituencies elected 2 MPs. Nevertheless, each elector had only 1 vote. So the Liberals would field 1 candidate, Labour would field 1 candidate, the Conservatives might put up 2. But in these Lib Lab seats, probably Labour would get 1 and the Liberals would get 1. It was rarely the Conservatives would get 1. But if the Liberals put up 2, then that would split the anti-Conservative vote, or the Labour put up 2. If both Labour and the Liberals put up 2, then the Conservatives might even get both of them. So those were done away with as per the Representation of the People Act 1918, and all constituencies became single-seater, because some constituencies had far more people than were needed for a constituency. They meant to be roughly equal in population, roughly 50,000 electors, not 50,000 people, electors. Remember, it's not till 18 that virtually every man had the vote. It was sort of male householders over 21 had the vote prior to that. Now, that was the majority of people, but there were people, particularly working class people, who were not the household, might be a lodger, and therefore didn't have the vote, and had to have been residing in the constituency for over a year. We can't have these blow-ins, these vagrants voting. That was the idea. So Ramsay MacDonald, he was elected to Parliament, I think first of all for Seaham, which is in Lancashire, if I remember correctly. He sat for a number of different constituencies. I think, did he sit for Leicester for a while? But the First World War broke out, and he said no war is at first unpopular. He refused to to support it. He thought this was a completely avoidable, unnecessary war in which millions of people were sure to be killed. It was a deeply unpopular view at the time. Now, the Labour leadership, they used to swap it almost annually, and he had been Labour leader since 1911. But on the 5th of August 1914, he tendered his resignation, and Arthur Henderson took over the leadership of the party. So Labour informally split into those who were pro-war and anti-war. They said there's a clear-cut legal and moral case. Privately, Ramsay and MacDonald said, well, actually, the government does have a case because of the Treaty of London, and Belgium's been invaded, and we gave them a chance to withdraw, but come on, the Allies are going to do bad things too. So his anti-war campaigning and anti-conscription campaigning got him booed a lot of the time. Though when casualties mounted and people became disillusioned with it, the war did become more unpopular, and some people began to think he was right, and he showed immense moral courage. Of course, he'd been called a traitor and accused of being pro-German and all the rest of it. But at the end of the war, they put a winner of the Victoria Cross up against him, and he was voted out of Parliament. But he came back pretty soon. He was made leader of the Labour Party again in 1921, though he didn't even have a seat. But he came back into Parliament. So in 1922, Labour became the second largest party. The Liberals were pushed into third place, and so it's always remained. Anyway, in 1923, there was another election called early. It was oh my God, how Stanley Baldwin had come in. Andrew Bonar Law stood down because he realised he was dying of cancer, so Stanley Baldwin wanted to bring in protective tariffs, imperial preference. He felt an election was needed for this. But anyway, although the Conservatives got more votes, Labour got more seats. So they hung on for about a month before finally Stanley Baldwin tendered his resignation, and King George V sent for Ramsay MacDonald. So Ramsay MacDonald kissed hands on the 22nd of January 1924, becoming the very first Labour Prime Minister. But Labour was a minority government. The Liberals were informally supportive. There was no coalition. The Liberals wanted to keep the Conservatives out. Of course, the Liberals were fatally split between Asquith, who was their official leader, and David Lloyd George, who had about the allegiance of about a third of the party. Remember, the Lloyd George Liberals had supported the national government in that coupon election of 1918. Lloyd George had been Prime Minister of a mostly Conservative government from 1916 to 22. Anyway, so it was great difficulty for Labour, and there were severe problems. There was stubbornly high unemployment, and how on earth we were going to manage the national debt. The national debt had increased 14-fold because of the First World War. There were so many disabled war veterans, war widows, orphans, and so on, and he was trying to cut military spending. But that only lasted till November, so it was only about 10 months that government before it fell. Another election came in, and the Conservatives were back in office under Stanley Baldwin. Nevertheless, James Ramsay MacDonald, he remained Labour leader, and in 1929 Labour won the election, so they were back in office with a small majority. And one of the leading lights of Labour Party at the time was Sir Oswald Mosley, who was Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and widely tipped to be the next Prime Minister. But so they were trying to struggle against unemployment, which remained obstinately high. And the Liberals had some of the brightest ideas. They published a pamphlet, "We Can Conquer Unemployment." Keynesianism was a new thing, wasn't widely accepted. John Maynard Keynes was, of course, a Liberal and received many pressing invitations to stand for Parliament in a safe Liberal seat. Such things existed back then, but he always declined these most tempting propositions. Anyhow, Labour was deeply unlucky in that the Wall Street crash struck only a few months after Labour was returned to office, and they had to contend with that, and they somehow struggled on with rising unemployment, and how on earth were they going to make ends meet when less tax revenue was coming in, but there were more demands on government spending, and they'd cut defence spending to the bone. And then 1931, there was almost nothing left to cut. There'd been the Inver-Gordon mutiny over rumours of a cut to naval pay. In fact, nobody was actually killed in the Inver-Gordon mutiny. It all was resolved peacefully, though some sailors got several years in prison. And one of them subsequently went to St. Petersburg, was Leningrad. The Soviet Union survived the siege of Leningrad, but then fell foul of Stalin and spent time in the gulags, just to show how communism is deeply inferior to capitalism. Anyhow, back to Ramsay MacDonald. So in 1931, the only thing they left to cut was unemployment benefit, so they decided they were going to have to do that. And for a lot of Labour people, this was absolutely unacceptable. This was the Holy Grail. They did not come into politics to cut living standards for the very poorest. Some people were very, very needy. I don't think a single person starved to death in this country, but a lot of people were going hungry, wearing rags, had holes in their shoes, didn't have enough coal to keep warm. This is before central heating. So for some of this was a moral bottom line. Nuh-uh, no way. So Ramsay MacDonald, he decamped with a handful of Labour MPs as supporters and formed the national government, a coalition with the Conservatives and Liberals. Some of the Liberals supported him, so a new election in 1931, and this national government, which was sort of 80% Conservatives, was swept to office. So again, a bit like under Lord George, a non-Tory Prime Minister has a mainly Tory government under him. This is how pragmatic they are. So he was reviled in Labour circles. He led the National Labour Party. Some people saw him as an absolute Judas, and he struggled on to 1935 when the situation had improved, unemployment had fallen a little bit, the economic situation was a little bit healthier. A lot of it was caused by going back into the gold standard in 1926 under Churchill, Winston Churchill as as Chancellor of the Exchequer. He had been against it himself, but that had been the conventional view. The suits in the city said it was the right thing to do, but perhaps it was foolish. Anyway, so Ramsay MacDonald then he decided to retire in 1935. By this time, he'd begun an adulterous relationship with a Duchess and was writing as a very, very frank, erotic